Chapter 28. Detail. It was 2 months since training. Kerry had done a mission, come back, and gone on another. She was so superior about it, James could have thumped her. Gabrielle was in Jamaica, Connor had disappeared with Shaquille, Bruce was away for days at a time, Kyle went off one morning promising that this mission was going to earn him his Navy shirt. James was still at Cherub and felt like a lemon. Amy was the only one who hadn't been away. She spent hours on the 8th floor in one of the mission preparation rooms. James still got to swim with her 4 times a week. He was good now. 400 metres front crawl, keeping his body under the water and tipping his face to the side to breathe without lifting his head out of the water. He never got scared, and Amy said his stroke was almost perfect. James and Amy were putting their uniforms back on. All they'd done was swim lengths together, then sit on the poolside and talk for a bit. "That was our last lesson," Amy said. James had known it was coming for ages, but that didn't stop him feeling bad. He liked hanging around with Amy. She was funny, and always gave good advice on stuff. "Is your mission starting?" James asked, sitting down to lace up his boots. "In a couple of weeks," Amy said. "I need to devote all my time to it. I'll miss having lessons with you. You're a brilliant teacher." "Thanks, James, you're sweet. You should go swimming with Kerry when she gets back. You swim as well as she does now. Probably better." "Oh, she'll be too busy rubbing my nose in it about her mission experience. I saw Meryl Spencer again yesterday. She still says there's no mission for me." "I can confess now," Amy said. "I had you suspended from mission activity." "Because of swimming?" James asked. Amy went in her swimming bag and got out a plastic card. James had seen people swipe them in the lift to get up to the secure part of the main building where missions were planned. "This is yours," Amy said, handing it across. James broke out smiling. "I've got a mission with you?" "Yes," Amy said. "I put in some work on this job before you even came here. When you arrived, I realised we looked alike. Same colour hair, similar build. I knew you could pass as my little brother. We set you up with Kerry so you had the best chance of passing training. I wasn't happy when I heard you started a fight with her and nearly got thrown out." "Oh, don't remind me," James said. "I was so dumb." "You're lucky Kerry didn't retaliate. All she had to do was flip you up and break your arm, and you would have been out of training. Nobody would have blamed her either." "I was on top of her," James said. "She couldn't get up." Amy laughed. "If you got on top of Kerry, it's because she let you. She could squash you like an egg under her boot if she wanted." "Is she that good?" James asked. Amy nodded. "She must like you a lot to let you off like that." The 8th floor was exactly like the accommodation floors below. A long corridor with rooms off either side. Entering the mission preparation room meant swiping your security card and staring into a red light while the blood vessels in your retina were scanned for identification. After the high-tech entry, James expected something flash inside. A map of the world with a bank of computer screens above it, or something. It was actually a bit of a dump. Old computers, chairs with sponge bursting out of cushions, and metal cabinets covered with stacks of files and papers. The only good feature was the view over campus. Hewitt Asker stuck his hand out for James to shake and introduced himself as the mission controller. He was in his 20s, cherub uniform, bleached hair with black roots, and a stud through his tongue. "First mission, James," Hewitt said. "Worried?" James shrugged. "Should I be?" Hewitt laughed. "Oh, I'm nervous, James. This baby is complicated. You wouldn't normally get something like this until you'd done a few easy missions, but we needed a 12-year-old boy who could pass for Amy's brother, and you're the best we've got. There's a ton of stuff to learn. I've cut your school schedule back. Amy has written a mission dossier for you. Don't be afraid to ask questions. The mission starts in about 10 days. James pulled up a chair and opened the briefing. Classified. Mission briefing for James Adams. Do not remove from room 812. Do not copy or make notes. 1. Fort Harmony. In 1612, King James made a 50 square kilometre area near the Welsh village of Cradow into common land. The charter allowed people to graze animals and build a small shelter on the land. By the 1870s, everyone who lived on Cradow Common had moved to the village to work in the coal mine. Nobody lived on the land for the next 97 years. In 1950, Cradow Common was made part of West Monmouthshire National Park. In 1967, a small group of hippies led by a woman called Gladys Dunn settled on Cradow Common. Gladys named the settlement Fort Harmony. They kept chickens and built wooden shelters, claiming they could do so under the 1612 charter. At first, the national park tolerated the settlers, but numbers grew, and within 3 years, about 270 hippies lived in 100 or so ramshackle buildings. The National Park Authority began legal action to evict the hippies. After 2 years, the High Court decided that the King's Charter ended when Cradow Common was made part of the national park. The court gave the hippies 1 week to pack up and leave. The hippies would not go. Police began destroying huts and arresting the hippies in the winter of 1972. The size of the community soon dropped to less than 50, but this hardcore was determined to stay. 2. The battle. The Fort Harmony residents fled every day, allowing police to demolish the shelters. They returned and made new shelters every night. The hippies dug underground tunnels. They also dug traps for the police to fall into. In one incident, a series of nets were hidden under leaves. When police moved in to demolish huts, the trap was sprung. 3 policemen were left swinging in nets 20 metres above ground. The hippies tied off the nets and ran away. A fire engine came to the rescue but got bogged down in thick mud. It was 7 hours before firemen found a way to cut down the nets without their cargo crashing to earth. Pictures of the policemen in the nets made most newspapers the following day. Newspaper coverage of the battle attracted dozens of new residents to Fort Harmony. On the 26th of August 1973, police launched an all-out effort to destroy Fort Harmony. 300 police were drafted from across Britain. Television and newspaper journalists watched. Roads were blocked to stop supporters reaching Fort Harmony. Police destroyed the camp and arrested anyone who resisted. By late morning, only 20 hippies remained, all barricaded in underground tunnels. Police decided entering the tunnels was too dangerous and waited for the hippies to come out for food and water. At 5 p.m, a section of tunnel collapsed under a passing police car. Police rushed to grab a pair of legs sticking out of the earth. Joshua Dunn, aged 9, son of the founder of Fort Harmony, was pulled out of the mud. While 2 officers held the wriggling boy by his ankles, a 3rd officer hit him over the head with a truncheon. A photographer captured the brutality. Pictures of the boy being stretchered into an ambulance made the television news. This incident caused a surge of public support for the hippies. The crowd trying to break through blockades and reach Fort Harmony grew to more than 1,000. By midnight, the police were exhausted. There were no reinforcements. By 3 a.m. the following morning, police lines were broken. At sunrise on the 27th of August, over 700 supporters were camping in the mud around Fort Harmony. A stream of cars and vans brought wood and supplies to build new shelters. The hippies left the tunnels and began rebuilding their homes. Next morning, the photograph of police beating 9-year-old Joshua Dunn made the front page of every newspaper in Britain. The police announced they would withdraw and destroy the camp at a later date. The police made a plan. 1,000 officers would be needed to remove all trace of Fort Harmony while successfully blockading the surrounding countryside. The police and National Park Authority didn't have enough money to pay for such a massive operation, so nothing further was done. 3. Fort Harmony today. 30 years later, Fort Harmony still exists. The residents live a harsh life, without running water or electricity in their homes. Camp founder Gladys Dunn is now 76. She wrote a best-selling autobiography in 1979. Her 3 sons, including Joshua, who suffered brain damage from the police assault, still live on site, as do many of her 10 grandchildren and 28 great-grandchildren. The camp has about 60 permanent residents. In warmer months, Fort Harmony swells to as many as 200, mostly students and backpackers who think Gladys Dunn is a hero. 4. Greenbrook. By 1996, the nearby village of Crackdown was in crisis. The coal mine was closed, over half the population was unemployed, and the village population had fallen from 2,000 residents in 1970 to less than 300. Run-down houses and mountains of black coal waste meant tourists didn't stop at Crackdown on their way to Fort Harmony or the national parks. Because of the high local unemployment, the national park allowed Greenbrook Conference Centre to be built on part of Crackdown Common. Greenbrook opened in 2002. It is enclosed by a 5-metre high fence with video cameras and electrified razor wire along the top. The centre hosts conferences and training courses. Facilities include a 765-room hotel, 1,200-seat auditorium, gym, spa, and 2 golf courses. There is parking for 1,000 cars and 30 helicopters. Many residents of Crackdown and Fort Harmony work in Greenbrook as receptionists, cooks, and cleaners. 5. Petracon 2004. In late 2003, Greenbrook announced the most prestigious event in its brief history. Petracon takes place in May 2004. It is a secretive 3-day meeting of 200 oil executives and politicians. The media is kept out. Among the guests will be oil ministers from Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and the chief executives of every major oil company. The 2 most important guests will be the United States Secretary of Energy and the Deputy Prime Minister of Great Britain. Security will be handled by the Diplomatic Protection Branch of the police, with MI5 and a small unit from Cherub. 6. Help Earth. At the end of 2003, a series of bombs were posted to United States congressmen and members of the British Parliament who support the oil industry. 4 workers in the US Congress building suffered injuries. Help Earth claimed responsibility. A month later, a French oil company executive working in Venezuela was killed by a car bomb. Help Earth again claimed responsibility. Shortly before its first attacks, Help Earth sent letters to the editors of several international newspapers, stating its aim to bring an end to the environmental carnage wreaked on our planet by the international oil companies and the politicians who support them. It then added, "Help Earth is the desperate cry of our dying planet. Time is running out. We are prepared to use violent means in the battle to save our environment." Peaceful environmental groups are at pains to distance themselves from Help Earth and have helped investigators compile a list of likely terrorist suspects. Despite this, nobody involved with Help Earth has been identified, although several environmental campaigners with a violent history are under suspicion. 4 of these suspects are current residents of Fort Harmony. The limited information on Help Earth suggests an attack on Petracon 2004 is likely. The size and nature of the attack is unknown. It could range from a small bomb destroying a car or a helicopter to a device capable of killing hundreds. Any Help Earth members planning terrorist action at Petracon 2004 will probably attempt to make links with Fort Harmony residents for the following reasons. A. Many Fort Harmony residents are veteran environmental campaigners. B. All Fort Harmony residents have a good knowledge of the local area. C. Many Fort Harmony residents have worked inside Greenbrook and can provide terrorists with information on operations and security. 7. The role of Cherub. MI5 already has informers and undercover agents within the environmental movement. However, MI5 wants extra agents at Fort Harmony in the build-up to Petracon 2004. Any new adult residents arriving at Fort Harmony before Petracon will be suspected of being undercover police or MI5 operatives. The chances of them getting useful information are small. Therefore, it has been decided that 2 Cherub operatives posing as relatives of Kathy Dunn, a long-standing member of the Fort Harmony community, will have the best chance of a successful undercover mission. Children will not be suspected of being intelligence agents, and they should mix easily with other members of the community. 29. Auntie. James reckoned he now knew more about Fort Harmony than anyone, including the people who lived there. He'd read Gladys Dunn's autobiography and 3 other books, as well as seeing tons of press cuttings, videos, and police files. He'd memorised the names and faces of every current Fort Harmony resident and loads of regular visitors. James also read the criminal records and MI5 files on anyone likely to be involved in the terrorist group Help Earth. James's undercover name was Ross Lee. His job was to hang out with kids at Fort Harmony, picking up gossip, sticking his nose where it didn't belong, and reporting anything suspicious to Cherub. James had a mobile to call Hewitt Asker. Hewitt was staying at Greenbrook for the duration of the mission. James's other equipment included a digital camera, his lock gun, and a can of pepper spray that was only for an emergency. Amy was his sister, Courtney Lee. Her job was to befriend Scargill Dunn, the 17-year-old grandson of Fort Harmony founder Gladys Dunn. Scargill was a loner who had dropped out of school and washed dishes in the kitchen at Greenbrook. Scargill's 22-year-old twin brothers, Fire and World, had both served short prison sentences for attacking the chairman of a fast food chain. MI5 believed Fire, World, and a couple called Bungle and Eleanor Evans were the residents of Fort Harmony most likely to be part of Help Earth. Kathy Dunn had briefly been married to Fire, World, and Scargill's dad, some years before they were born. Since then, Kathy had lived alone at Fort Harmony. Like most residents, she grew food and kept a few chickens, but it wasn't enough to survive. She did odd jobs when they cropped up: cleaning, fruit picking. Sometimes Kathy sold information to the police. There were always a few dodgy people at Fort Harmony. If a drug dealer or a runaway kid turned up, Kathy would walk to Craddo and call from the village phone box. Half the time, the police weren't interested in what Kathy had to tell them. If they were, they only paid 10 or 20 quid. Maybe 50 if it was a drug dealer, and they caught him with a lot of stuff. Kathy wasn't comfortable being a snitch, but sometimes it made the difference between having enough to buy a bottle of gas for the heater and freezing in her hut. After Petracon was announced, the police got more interested in what Kathy had to say. The value of information went up. Kathy got at least £30 every time, and they wanted to know everything that was going on at Fort Harmony: who came, who went, if anyone did anything suspicious, if there was an argument. Kathy got a taste for the money. She soon had a roll of notes stashed in a baked bean tin. MI5 made Kathy an offer: £2,000 to let a couple of undercover agents stay with her at Fort Harmony in the weeks before Petracon. Kathy didn't like the idea much. She'd lived alone for 30 years. MI5 offered more money until Kathy gave in. James, Amy and Hewitt walked into the Bristol Travel House. It was a basic hotel attached to a motorway service station. Kathy Dunn was waiting in her room in a cloud of cigarette smoke. "My name is Hewitt. These two are Ross and Courtney." Kathy sat up on her bed. She looked half drunk and tons older than all the pictures James had seen of her. "Who the hell are you?" Kathy asked. "We spoke on the phone," Hewitt said. "You're going to be looking after Ross and Courtney until the conference." "You've had me stuck in this hole for 3 days," Kathy said. "Now you turn up with 2 kids. If this is your idea of a joke, I'm not laughing." "You made a deal with us," Hewitt said. "This is the deal. I agreed to let 2 undercover agents stay with me, not look after 2 kids. Ross and Courtney are agents. Make their breakfast and send them to school for a few weeks. It's not brain surgery. The government uses children to do its dirty work? Kathy asked. Yes, Hewitt said. Kathy laughed. Oh, that's absolutely appalling. I won't do it. You already took our money, Hewitt said. Can you afford to pay us back? I went to Greece, and I spent some money tidying up my hut. Well, looks like you're stuck with us then. What if I refuse to take them? Kathy asked. What if I went to the press and told everyone you're using kids to spy on people? If you go to the press, they'll just think you're some flaky old hippie, Hewitt said. Nobody will believe a word out of your hole. Even if you get someone to believe you, you signed the Official Secrets Act before you took the money. You'd be looking at 10 years in prison for releasing classified information. Kathy looked upset. I've always helped the police. Now you treat me like dirt. Hewitt grabbed Kathy's jumper. He lifted her up and knocked her against the wall. You don't break deals with us, Hewitt shouted. There's 6 months' work gone into this operation. You're getting $8,000 to look after these kids for a few weeks. If that's being treated like dirt, you can treat me like dirt whenever you like. James was shocked seeing Hewitt flip out. Until now, the mission had felt like part of a competition to do better than Kyle, Bruce, and Kerry. Now it felt real. People could get blown apart by bombs or end up in prison for the rest of their lives. James suddenly didn't feel up to the job. He was a 12-year-old kid who should be going to school and messing around with his mates. Amy noticed the scared look on James's face. She put a hand on his shoulder. Stand outside if you want to, Amy whispered. I'm fine, James lied. Amy gave Hewitt a shove. Calm down, leave her alone, Amy said. Hewitt backed off, giving Amy a filthy look. Kathy sat on the bed. Amy passed Kathy a cigarette. Amy had to light it because Kathy's hands were shaking. Sorry about Hewitt, Amy said. Bit of a short fuse. You okay? Kathy nodded. Listen, Kathy, Amy said gently. We get up, go to school, hang out at Fort Harmony, then we go away again. It's the easiest money you'll ever make. Kathy shook her head. It's all a bit of a shock, that's all. Amy smiled. It always is. Nobody gets told we're kids until the last minute. How can I explain that I got you two living with me? Kathy asked, taking a deep puff on her cigarette. Niece and nephew, Amy said. Remember your sister? I haven't seen her in 20 years, Kathy said. She wrote a few times. Remember what your sister called her kids? Hewitt asked, voice back to normal. Kathy worked it out. Ross and Courtney, she said. We tracked down your sister, Hewitt said. She lives in Scotland, still married. The real Ross and Courtney are fine, but here's your story. A week ago, you got a letter. Your sister is going through a nasty divorce. You rushed to London to meet her. She couldn't cope with her kids, especially Ross, who's been expelled from school. You got on well with the kids, so you offered to look after them at Fort Harmony until your sister gets her life back on track. Hewitt handed Kathy a set of car keys. Land Cruiser, Hewitt said. Big 4-wheel drive. It's a couple of years old, worth about $10,000. Tell everyone it's your sister's car. If you look after the kids and the mission works out, we won't be asking for it back. The 4 of them made their way down to the hotel lobby. You better go to the toilet with me, Hewitt said. It's a long drive down to Wales. I just went, James said. Hewitt gave James a look. James realised Hewitt wanted to speak to him. The toilet was deserted. You okay, James? Hewitt said, unzipping his jeans. You looked a bit off colour when I grabbed Kathy. Why'd you go psycho with her? Hewitt smiled. Ever heard of good cop, bad cop? Well, they do it on TV, James said. Is that what you and Amy just did? If Kathy's not sure whose side she's on, you and Amy wouldn't be safe. Once I realised Kathy was getting stroppy, I had to be the bad cop and scare her. Amy's job was to be the good cop. Amy defended Kathy when I threatened her, then calmed her down. James smiled. So Kathy's afraid of what might happen if she doesn't do what we want her to do, but at the same time she thinks Amy is her friend. Exactly, James. You could have told me when you arranged to do it. We didn't arrange it. Amy knew what to do when I started getting tough with Kathy. Amy's brilliant at picking up stuff like that. What if Kathy caused any more problems? Would you really hurt her? Only if the mission depended on it, and I had no other choice. Sometimes we have to do bad things to make missions work. Remember when you sneaked to London before training? Sure, James said, smashing up that big house. The security guards on the gate got gassed by MI5. What do you think happened to them after they woke up? How should I know? They got sacked for sleeping at work. They won't get another security job with that on their records. So what happened to them? We ruined their lives, Hewitt said. Hopefully they got jobs doing something different. We didn't help them or nothing? No, we couldn't, without risking the secrecy of the mission. That's terrible, James said. How can we do that to people? We were trying to get info about a man selling weapons to terrorists. The weapons could kill hundreds of people, so we decided it was okay if 2 people lost their jobs. And it's the same with scaring Kathy, James said. People could get killed. Like they say, James, you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Kathy enjoyed driving James and Amy in the Land Cruiser, blasting down the M4, testing all the buttons and gadgets. Amy was up front. James laid flat across the back seat. Kathy and Amy chatted like old pals. When they stopped for petrol, Kathy bought a Jefferson Airplane CD with some housekeeping money Hewitt had given her. She put it on full blast. Amy and Kathy puffed one cigarette after another. James stuck his coat over his head to escape the noise and smoke. James sat up when they got off the motorway. He was impressed with the green fields and hills with sheep dotted over them. They stopped in Craddo for cigarettes and groceries and reached Fort Harmony soon after 3 p.m. Half a dozen grimy kids ran towards the 4-wheel drive as it climbed uphill to Kathy's hut. James knew the name and age of every kid. Kathy's ex-husband, Michael Dunn, and his brother Joshua walked towards the car. Michael thumped the bonnet. "Nice wheels, Kathy," Michael said. "You win the lottery or something?" James got out. His trainer was swallowed by mud. The camp looked a mess, flaking paint and windows stuck up with tape. James decided he was going to hate living here. Amy squelched to the back of the car and grabbed 2 pairs of wellies. "My niece and nephew," Kathy said. James sat in the car and pulled on his wellies. Joshua Dunn held out a gloved hand. James shook it. "Come soup?" Joshua stuttered. Amy and Kathy were heading towards a big hut. James and Joshua followed. About 15 people were inside. Chickens and a huge pot of vegetable soup cooked over an open fire. "Vegetarian?" Joshua asked. James shook his head. Joshua fetched James a bowl of soup and some chicken. There were cushions and beanbags along the walls, but the kids all sat cross-legged near the fire. James sat with them. He ate a couple of spoonfuls of soup. It tasted pretty good. Then he looked at his hands. They were filthy, but the other kids, who were all 10 times dirtier, scoffed the chicken with bare fingers. A hand rested on James's shoulder. It was Gladys Dunn. "A bit of dirt won't harm you, boy," she laughed. Gladys looked her 76 years, but the outdoor lifestyle kept her lean, and she moved well for her age. A 5-year-old girl sitting beside James ran her tongue up her filthy palm and held it out for James to see. James grabbed a bit of chicken and stuffed it in his mouth. The girl smiled. A group led by Michael Dunn built an extension on Kathy's hut for James and Amy to sleep in. It was impressive watching the community work as a team. First, they laid out paving slabs to raise the floor off the ground. The floor was chipboard wrapped in plastic. The framework was timber. Michael Dunn had obviously built loads of huts. He sawed each piece without measuring and never made a mistake. Others took the wood as soon as it was cut and knew where each piece fitted. Thick corner posts were bashed into the ground. Trusses were nailed between them. Hardboard was nailed to either side of the frame, with shredded paper packed in the cavity as insulation. A hole was made up in one side and a recycled window was fixed in. When it got dark, Kathy turned on the Land Cruiser headlamps. Once the room was on, 2 boys were lifted up. They crawled around nailing down a layer of waterproof felt. Inside, James helped seal the gap between the floor and the walls with grey putty. After it was finished, Amy got a rug from the Land Cruiser and set out sleeping bags and pillows. Kathy found a small paraffin heater. Michael Dunn said he would paint the outside in the morning. Finally, James and Amy were left alone. Chapter 30. Camp. The new shelter was quite cosy once you got used to the wind blasting the outside. James's sleeping bag rested on a foam camping mattress. He couldn't get comfortable. Amy snored. James shouted at her twice. The third time, Amy said she'd punch him if he woke her up again. James stuck a pillow over his head. James woke at 3 a.m, busting for a pee. He was used to walking 2 steps to his bathroom at Cherub. It was tougher here. He couldn't find his torch, so he had to put on jeans in the dark, then make his way blindly through the main part of the hut, stepping around Kathy, who was sprawled over a futon. James felt for the door, where all the wellies were lined up. He wasn't sure which pair was his, so he stuck on the first pair he found and stepped into the blackness. There were portable toilets on site, but James couldn't find them in the dark, so he wandered into the nearest group of trees. He wiped mud off his hands onto his trousers, undid his jeans, and started to piss. Something shrieked and brushed against his leg. James jolted. He was peeing on one of the chickens that roamed around camp. He turned away, but that was into the wind, so his urine got blown all over his jeans. James stumbled back, tripped over the hysterical chicken, and hit the mud. There was no way to get clean. He wondered why this type of thing never happened to spies in films. Amy was up, and she'd slept fine. She'd stuck her foot over James's face to wake him up. "Shower day, Ross," Amy said. James burst into life. "Oh, get that stink off my face," James said, pushing Amy's foot away. "Who's Ross?" "You are, stupid," Amy whispered. "Oh, sorry," James gasped, realising where he was. "I must remember that." "There's a rota for hot water," Amy said. "You get 1 shower a week. Fridays, boys." "1 shower a week?" James said. "With all this mud? How do you think I feel? I've got to wait 4 days, and I don't exactly smell great right now." Kathy showed him where the wash hut was. It was narrow, with a reservoir of rainwater on the roof. Every morning, a gas boiler heated enough water to run the showers for 10 minutes. If you missed out, you stank for another week. James dashed to the shower hut and stripped. There were 8 boys under the water, sharing bars of soggy white soap and messing about. Mums stood outside, telling the little ones to get a move on. The water was barely warm. James rubbed soap in his hair as the hot ran out. The others knew better and scrambled off. James had to rinse with a bucket of freezing rainwater. He sprinted back to Kathy's hut wearing wellies and a big towel. Kathy was cooking bacon and eggs on a portable gas stove. It smelled good, and there was plenty of it. "Do you kids drink coffee?" Kathy asked. "It's all I've got." James didn't care what it was as long as it was warm. He drank 2 cups and stuffed down 4 rashers of bacon and 2 runny fried eggs, mopping the yolk off his plate with white bread. "I've got to go enroll Ross in school," Kathy said. Then I'll go to Tesco. Anything you two want? Mars bars, James said. What about enrolling Courtney? After you went to bed, I met this guy Scargill, Amy said. He said he'd try and fix me a job at Greenbrook. James was impressed Amy had made such a fast attachment to Scargill. He was also miffed that she'd got out of school. I guess you'll start school on Monday, Ross, Kathy said. Friday night here is usually a laugh. Everyone turns up after dark. We build a bonfire and play music and stuff. Amy stayed in the hut making phone calls to Hewitt Asker, telling him the change in her plans and getting him to sort out the paperwork she needed to get a job. James spent the morning exploring. There were about 50 buildings at Fort Harmony. They varied, from the main hut, with space for 30 and its own supply of electricity, down to rat holes fit only for storing junk. Between huts were chicken coops, vegetable patches, strings of washing, and a range of battered cars. There were rusty vans everywhere, though most had no wheels, and rested on bricks. Everyone James met had grubby clothes and long tangled hair. The older men had beards. Most of the younger ones had daft goatees and piercings everywhere. They all acted friendly, and everyone asked James the same questions about how he ended up here and how long he was staying. By the time he'd met 5 people, James was sick of repeating himself. Before long, James realised he had a tail. 3-year-old Gregory Evans. He was the son of Brian Bungle Evans and his partner Eleanor. MI5 thought they might have links to Help Earth. Gregory followed James at a distance. When James looked around, Gregory would crouch down and cover his face with his hands. It turned into a game. James stopped walking and looked around every few steps. Gregory was giggling. After a bit, Gregory got up his courage and started walking beside James. James remembered he had a couple of Maltesers in his pocket and gave them to the toddler. After stuffing them, Gregory ran off. He stopped, turned, and shouted at James. "Come to my house!" James felt odd being bossed around by a 3-year-old. They ran about 100 metres, Gregory leading James by the hand. Gregory sat down on the doorstep of a smartly painted hut and pulled off his wellies. "Come in," Gregory said. James put his head in the door. The hut had room for 6 to sleep. The floor was painted bright orange, with shocking green walls and a purple ceiling. Plastic dolls hung everywhere. James noticed they were mutants, with blood painted on their faces and freaky punk hairstyles. "Who's that?" Bungle asked, with an American twang. James was embarrassed, standing in a strange doorway on the orders of a 3-year-old. Sorry, Gregory brought me here," James explained. "What you sorry for, boy?" Bungle said. "We're a community. Come in. Get your boots off. Gregory's always dragging kids in here. You want hot milk?" James pulled his wellies off and stepped inside. It was wonderfully warm, but smelled like farts and sweat. Eleanor lay on a mattress. She had nothing on but knickers and a Nirvana t-shirt stretched over a pregnant belly. Gregory gave his mum a cuddle. Bungle made introductions, asked James the same questions as everyone else, then handed him a mug of hot milk. "Unzip your tracksuit top, Ross," Bungle said. James was mystified, but did what he was asked. "Reebok," Bungle said triumphantly. "What?" James asked, confused. "He hates people who wear clothes with trademarks on," Eleanor explained. "What's wrong with what I'm wearing?" James asked. "I don't hate the people," Bungle said. "I hate the clothes. Look at yourself, Ross. Puma jacket, Nike tracksuit, Reebok t-shirt. Even his socks have got a logo on them." "Just ignore Bungle," Eleanor said. "He thinks people wearing labels on their clothes is a sign that they can't think for themselves." Bungle rushed over to a bookshelf and passed James a book called No Logo. "Give your brain a bit of exercise," Bungle said. "Read it. If you want, we can discuss it when you bring it back." James took the book. "I'll look at it," James said. "All my stuff is Nike in that. At my old school, you got your head stuck down the toilet if you wore unfashionable clothes. Oh, for God's sake, Bungle, Eleanor said. He's a kid. He's not interested in that stuff. James didn't care what some hippie thought about his clothes, but the book gave James an excuse to come back and hang around a prime suspect, so he put it in his pocket and said thanks. Ross, ask him about the dolls before he bores you to death talking about the evils of world capitalism, Eleanor said. Bungle sounded annoyed. You handed out leaflets with us, Eleanor. Eleanor laughed. Ross, in principle, I support fair wages for people in poor countries. I want to help save the environment. I want Bungle and his pals to save the world. But I'm 8 months pregnant, the baby presses on my insides, so every half hour I waddle through 200 metres of filth to go sit on a stinking portable toilet. Gregory is driving me crazy. My ankles are swollen like beach balls, and I'm half terrified the car we borrowed is going to break down on the way to the hospital when I go into labour. I'd happily surrender all my principles for a comfy bed in a private hospital. James sat on the floor and sipped his hot milk. The dolls are excellent, he said. Did you make them? That's my living, Bungle said. Bungle pulled one of the dolls off the ceiling and dropped it in James's lap. It was the torso and head of an action man, but it wore a tutu and had skinny ballerina legs glued on. The hair was spiky purple. One hand was cut off and the stump was painted with fake blood. Cool, James said. I buy the dolls at jumble sales and boot fairs. Then I mix all the bits up and make weird costumes and stuff out of scraps. How much? James asked. Depends where, Bungle said. Cardiff Market. They're all poor. Nobody will pay more than £10. If I get a stall at Camden in London, you can sell them for 18 a throw. When it's packed out in the summer, you can shift $60 a day. One time I sold 84. 1,512 quid in a day, James said. You must be loaded. You some sort of human adding machine? Bungle asked. James laughed. Kind of. Takes over an hour to make each one. Painting all the fiddly bits does your eyes in. You want a doll, Ross? Oh, they're cool, James said. I haven't got any money, though. I'll take one, Bungle said. Maybe you can do us a favour. Look after Gregory for a couple of hours one day, or something. It was an unwritten Fort Harmony rule that there was a free evening meal in the main hut for anyone who wanted it. Gladys Dunn bought vegetables from local farmers with the money she earned from her book. Joshua spent his afternoons preparing the vegetables and making either stew or curry. Everyone eating together was what made Fort Harmony a community, rather than a bunch of separate families. James ate with the kids when they got out of school. Michael Dunn collected a vanload of scrap from a local dump. All the kids helped pile up old doors and bits of furniture to make a bonfire for the evening festivities. James tried to make friends with Sebastian and Clark Dunn. They were 10 and 11-year-old brothers, cousins of Fire, World and Scargill. The Dunns were a close family, and Sebastian and Clark were James's best chance to pick up all the gossip.